Something strange keeps happening to people who begin to awaken. They have a breakthrough, then a breakdown. They touch something larger than themselves, expanded awareness, clarity, a sense that reality is deeper than they were taught. And shortly after, everything starts to collapse. Their identity destabilizes. Their emotions become unpredictable. Their sense of meaning fractures. Some recover. Some regress into something smaller than before. And some never truly come back. You've probably seen this happen, or lived it. And the disturbing question is this: why can some people move through awakening and integrate it, while others completely shatter? Carl Jung spent decades observing this exact phenomenon, not in monasteries, not in spiritual retreats, but in the consulting room, treating people who weren't seeking enlightenment, but were breaking under its pressure. And what Jung discovered was deeply unsettling. Most people don't fail awakening because they are weak. They fail because awakening places demands on the psyche that most psychological structures simply cannot support. Awakening isn't a beautiful upgrade to your personality. It isn't a spiritual achievement you add to who you already are. It's a psychological death, a dismantling of the ego structure that once kept you functional, oriented, and safe in the world. And when that structure collapses too quickly, or without preparation, the psyche doesn't expand. It fragments. Jung called this spiritual emergency, not enlightenment, a crisis caused by consciousness expanding faster than the psyche can contain. And this is where most people misunderstand what's happening. They think awakening is failing them. They think they are losing their minds. They think something has gone wrong. But what's actually happening is far more precise. The ego is fighting for survival, because the ego's primary function is not growth. It's preservation. And when awakening threatens the identity you've built your entire life around, the ego doesn't disappear peacefully. It activates defense mechanisms, subtle ones, intelligent ones, self-protective ones. It sabotages the process, not because it's evil, but because it believes your psychological survival depends on stopping what's happening. This is the part no spiritual teacher likes to talk about. Your ego will not allow awakening to continue if it feels unprepared to die and reorganize itself. And in this video, we are going to explore what Carl Jung identified as the most common ways the ego sabotages spiritual awakening, why so many people collapse right after they break through, and how to recognize the difference between transformation and psychological overload. Because if you're on this path, or if you've already felt yourself pulling back, losing clarity, or spiraling after a powerful opening, understanding this might be the difference between integration and disintegration. The first way the ego sabotages awakening is subtle. So subtle that most people never realize it's happening. They don't stop the process out of fear. They stop it out of misunderstanding. Because what they believe is awakening is often just an experience, a powerful one, sometimes overwhelming, sometimes beautiful, a moment of oneness, a flood of insight, a sense of clarity so intense it feels like arrival. And the ego loves this stage, not because it wants transformation, but because it can use the experience without dying. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly. A person would have a profound opening through meditation, crisis, emotional collapse, psychedelics, or spontaneous insight, and mistake that opening for completion. They would say, "I'm awake now." But awakening is not a peak state. It's not a feeling you maintain, and it's not something you reach and then protect. Real awakening is integration. It's the slow, often uncomfortable process of reorganizing your entire psychological structure around a deeper truth. And when an experience fades, as all experiences do, the ego panics, because it believed the experience was the transformation. One of Jung's patients described it this way: they touched a state of unity so powerful it felt like everything finally made sense. For days, The world felt transparent. Meaning was effortless. Fear vanished. And then, it was gone. Ordinary consciousness returned. Emotions resurfaced. The mind filled with noise again. They became desperate. Not to grow, but to recreate the experience. They chased it through practices, substances, ideas, teachers. And when it didn't return, they collapsed into confusion and despair. Jung explained this with brutal clarity. What they had wasn't awakening. It was a glimpse. And mistaking a glimpse for transformation creates what Jung called spiritual inflation. The ego expands around the experience, identifies with it, builds a new self-image. I am awakened. But when reality doesn't sustain that identity, the ego experiences it as loss. Not of an experience, but of self. And instead of integrating what was revealed, the person becomes attached to a memory of transcendence. You can recognize this pattern easily. People who talk endlessly about past mystical moments, but show no psychological maturity. People who had a breakthrough years ago and never moved beyond it. People addicted to peak states, but unable to function fully in ordinary life. They are not awakening. They are protecting an identity built around an experience. And when reality challenges that identity, the ego doesn't integrate. It collapses. Or worse, it sabotages further transformation to preserve the illusion. But this is only the first layer of sabotage, and it's not even the most dangerous. Because even when someone understands that awakening isn't about chasing experiences, most people still don't have what Jung considered essential: the psychological structure required to hold what's coming next. And this is where the real breakdowns begin. Even when someone understands that awakening is not about chasing experiences, most still collapse for a deeper reason. They don't have the psychological structure to hold what opens. Jung was very precise about this. Consciousness can expand faster than the psyche can contain it. And when that happens, expansion doesn't lead to clarity. It leads to fragmentation. The ego isn't meant to disappear overnight. It's meant to transform slowly, strengthening, reorganizing, integrating. But many people attempt awakening without building what Jung called ego strength. They want to transcend the ego before it's stable. They want light before they've integrated shadow. They want dissolution before they've learned how to stay grounded in ordinary life. Jung compared this to architecture. You don't build upward without a foundation. You don't remove the scaffolding before the structure can stand on its own. Yet this is exactly what happens in premature awakening. People open themselves to intense practices, powerful insights, or altered states, but they haven't developed emotional regulation, psychological stability, or a coherent sense of self. So when unconscious material rises, and it always does, there's nothing to contain it. One of Jung's patients described this collapse vividly. They entered an intense retreat with no preparation. Long hours of meditation. Strong techniques. Minimal grounding. At first, it felt euphoric. Visions. Synchronicities. A sense that reality was dissolving. And then it became unbearable. They couldn't focus. They couldn't complete simple tasks. Their emotions flooded without warning. They thought they were losing their mind. Jung's diagnosis was direct. They had expanded consciousness before consolidating the psyche. The ego was too weak to die properly and reorganize. The shadow wasn't integrated enough to surface safely. Everything flooded at once. This is what Jung meant by premature awakening. Not enlightenment, but overload. The psyche opens before it knows how to close. And instead of rebirth, the person experiences disintegration. You'll recognize this pattern in people who awaken powerfully, then lose basic functionality. They can't work. They can't relate. They can't orient themselves in everyday reality. Not because awakening failed, but because the container broke. And when the ego senses this instability, it does something very specific. It tries to shut the process down, not consciously, not dramatically, but through subtle self-sabotage, avoidance, distraction, sudden doubt, a sense that this isn't working anymore. The ego isn't resisting truth. It's trying to prevent collapse. Jung was adamant about this. You must build ego before you transcend ego. You must integrate shadow before you expand consciousness. You must develop psychological strength before undergoing psychological death. But structure alone is still not enough, because even a strong psyche can break if it has no one to hold it. And this leads to the next form of self-sabotage, one that destroys people not through weakness, but through isolation. Even a strong psyche can fracture if it goes through awakening alone. Jung understood something most modern systems still don't. Transformation of this magnitude requires a witness, someone who has walked the territory, someone who can hold the process steady while identity dissolves and reorganizes. Without that container, the psyche enters panic. Think about how this shows up in culture. In Black Swan, Nina's awakening into her darker, more powerful self happens in total isolation. There's no guide, no integration, only pressure. What begins as transformation turns into psychological collapse. In Joker, Arthur's break from his old identity is treated entirely as pathology. No one mirrors meaning back to him. No one names what's happening. Without containment, the psyche doesn't integrate, it polarizes. Jung saw this pattern constantly in his practice. People undergoing ego death, shadow flooding, and reality deconstruction, while everyone around them labeled it illness, instability, or danger. Doctors tried to suppress it. Family members panicked. Friends withdrew, and the person began to doubt themselves, not because the process was wrong, but because no one could say, this is part of transformation. In traditional cultures, awakening was never a solo act. There were elders, initiators, ritual containers. Modern individuals attempted alone, often with nothing but online content and self-diagnosis. And isolation turns intensity into terror. Without a witness, the ego does something predictable. It aborts the process. It retreats into numbness, medication, distraction, or complete shutdown, not because awakening failed, but because the psyche couldn't survive being unheld. Jung became that witness for many of his patients, not by giving answers, but by staying present while they disintegrated and reformed. And without that presence, many would have been institutionalized, or would have shut the process down entirely. But isolation isn't the most dangerous form of sabotage. The next one feels spiritual. It feels justified, and it quietly derails transformation before it ever reaches integration. One of the most dangerous ways the ego sabotages awakening is by using it as an escape. Jung saw this again and again. People didn't seek awakening to transform their lives. They sought it to avoid them. They wanted transcendence as a way out of pain, out of trauma, out of responsibility, out of ordinary human difficulty. But awakening doesn't lift you above life. It drops you directly into it. And this is where many people turn back. Jung called this spiritual bypassing, using spiritual ideas to avoid psychological work. Instead of facing a broken relationship, they spoke about higher consciousness. Instead of processing trauma, they spoke about letting go. Instead of taking responsibility, they spoke about everything being an illusion. At first, it looks peaceful, detached, calm, above the mess, but beneath it is avoidance. And when real awakening begins, it removes every escape route. It forces confrontation with grief, with anger, with unhealed wounds, with the parts of life that can't be transcended, only lived through. Jung described patients who came seeking spiritual development, only to leave when the work demanded honesty, When awakening required them to address a marriage instead of escaping it, to feel childhood pain instead of rising above it, to ground into responsibility instead of floating into meaning. They didn't fail awakening. They rejected it, because they weren't looking for transformation. They were looking for relief. And when awakening refused to anesthetize their humanity, the ego stepped in. It reframed avoidance as wisdom, withdrawal as enlightenment, numbness as peace, and the process quietly stopped. But there is one final sabotage, the deepest one, the one that happens right at the edge of real transformation. At the deepest point of awakening, something decisive happens. Not outside, inside. This is where most people don't collapse loudly. They don't have a breakdown. They don't spiral into chaos. They simply stop. They lose momentum. Interest fades. The urgency disappears. And it looks harmless. But Jung knew exactly what was happening. Because awakening doesn't threaten your comfort first. It threatens your identity. Most people imagine awakening as something that enhances who they already are. More awareness layered onto the same personality. More insight added to the same life story. But real awakening doesn't decorate the ego. It dismantles it. Slowly at first. Then completely. The personality you've relied on to survive. The story you've told yourself about who you are. The identity that earned love, status, safety, belonging. All of it begins to loosen. And this is where the ego panics. Not in an emotional way. In a biological one. Because the ego isn't philosophical. It's not spiritual. It's a survival structure. Its job is to keep the organism intact. So when awakening begins to dissolve the familiar self, not symbolically, but experientially, the ego experiences this as existential danger. Jung described this moment as the most intense psychological conflict a person can face. On one side, the impulse toward individuation, toward truth, toward becoming whole. On the other, the instinct to preserve identity at all costs. And most people don't even realize a choice is being made. They don't think, I'm choosing safety over transformation. Instead, the ego intervenes quietly. Doubt appears where clarity once lived. Distractions multiply. Old habits return with new urgency. The work suddenly feels unnecessary, or exaggerated, or not aligned anymore. And because the ego is intelligent, it never frames this as fear. It reframes it as wisdom. I've gone far enough. I don't need to go deeper. I should focus on normal life now. Jung saw this exact pattern repeatedly. Patients would reach the edge of genuine transformation, where their self-concept began to dissolve, and suddenly retreat. Not backward into chaos, but sideways into comfort. One of his most revealing cases involved a woman who had built her entire life around intellectual mastery. She was admired, respected, defined by her brilliance. She came seeking spiritual depth, meaning, inner truth. And for a time, the process worked. Her certainty began to soften. Her rigid self-image loosened. New layers of psyche emerged. But as awakening progressed, something terrifying happened. She could no longer rely on who she thought she was. Her intelligence no longer protected her. Her status no longer grounded her. Her identity no longer felt solid. She began saying, I don't know who I am anymore. And the tone mattered. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't openness. It was fear. Jung understood immediately. She wasn't afraid of awakening. She was afraid of ego death. Because ego death doesn't feel like spiritual rebirth in the moment. It feels like annihilation. It feels like losing your orientation in the world. Like stepping into life without a map. Like standing naked without the armor that once kept you safe. And the ego cannot tolerate that. So it does what it always does when survival is threatened. It sabotages. Not with destruction, but with retreat. People suddenly abandon practices that were working. They disengage from reflection. They create crises in relationships. They become busy. They become skeptical. Not because the path failed, but because it was succeeding. You can recognize this moment clearly. It's when someone gets very close to truth and suddenly finds 1,000 reasons not to continue. When insight deepens and behavior regresses. When awakening demands surrender and the ego responds with preservation. This is the final defense. The ego would rather keep you partially awake and psychologically intact than allow full transformation that dissolves who you believe you are. And from the ego's perspective, this is not weakness. It's intelligence. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. But awakening does not negotiate with survival structures. It demands death before rebirth. And most people, when faced with that demand, unconsciously choose to remain who they are rather than discover who they might become. They don't fail awakening. They protect themselves from it. And this, more than confusion, more than lack of structure, more than isolation, is the deepest form of self-sabotage Jung ever identified. Carl Jung never romanticized awakening. He didn't describe it as a spiritual achievement, a peak state, or a reward for those who worked hard enough. He described it as one of the most demanding psychological transformations a human being can undergo. A confrontation not only with light, but with everything that has been avoided, suppressed, or organized around survival. This is why Jung insisted on something deeply uncomfortable. Not everyone should attempt awakening, and that is not a spiritual failure. Awakening is not self-improvement. It's not becoming a better version of who you already are. It is the dismantling of the structure that made your life functional. And modern psychology is beginning to confirm what Jung observed decades ago. Contemporary trauma researchers like Gabor Mate have shown that when deep material surfaces without safety, the nervous system doesn't experience healing, it experiences threat. Instead of integration, the body moves into fight, flight, freeze, or collapse. Similarly, Stanislav Grof, who studied spiritual emergence and spiritual emergency, warned that expanded states of consciousness without grounding and support often resemble psychosis, not because they are pathological, but because the system is overwhelmed. And more recently, research into the polyvagal nervous system, through the work of Stephen Porges, has made something very clear. When the nervous system does not feel safe, transformation cannot stabilize. This is where many people misunderstand what's happening in their own lives. They think they are failing spiritually, when in reality, their body is signaling overload. You see this in ordinary, everyday situations. Someone starts deep inner work and suddenly can't sleep. They feel disconnected at work. Simple conversations feel exhausting. Their tolerance for noise, conflict, or social interaction collapses. They think something is wrong with them, but often, nothing is wrong. Their system expanded faster than it could regulate. Modern spirituality rarely talks about this. It encourages expansion without asking whether someone can still pay bills, maintain relationships, regulate emotions, or stay grounded in daily life. Jung would have called this dangerous, because awakening does not bypass the nervous system. It moves through it, and without ego strength, shadow integration, emotional regulation, and real-world stability, expanded awareness becomes destabilizing instead of liberating. This is why Jung emphasized preparation. Before transcendence, consolidation. Before dissolution, structure. Before ego death, ego maturity. In practical terms, this looks very ordinary. Can you tolerate frustration without dissociating? Can you stay present in uncomfortable conversations? Can you feel grief without collapsing into it? Can you hold contradictory truths without needing immediate certainty? These are not spiritual questions. They are psychological foundations. And without them, awakening places demands on the psyche that it simply cannot sustain. This is also why isolation is so damaging in this process. In traditional cultures, initiatory experiences were held inside community. There were elders, guides, witnesses. Today, people attempt awakening alone, guided by books, videos, and fragmented information, while their families worry, doctors pathologize, and friends don't understand what's happening. Research on trauma consistently shows that co-regulation is essential for nervous system stability. In simple terms, we heal in relationship. Awakening is no different. If you are already in this process and struggling, Jung would not tell you to push harder. He would tell you to slow down, to ground, to stabilize, to seek support from someone who understands transformation, not just symptom management. And if you're watching someone you care about go through this, understand something crucial. They don't need fixing. They don't need constant advice. They need containment. Someone who can stay calm when they feel unmoored. Someone who doesn't rush to label their experience. Someone who can say, "You're not broken. Your system is reorganizing." Jung believed awakening is rare not because people lack capacity, but because it demands responsibility. Responsibility for one's psyche. Responsibility for one's relationships. Responsibility for the pace of transformation. There is no obligation to awaken. There is no hierarchy of consciousness that makes one life more valid than another. And there is no shame in choosing stability over dissolution. But if you do choose this path, Jung would urge you to respect it. Respect the intelligence of the ego. Respect the limits of the nervous system. Respect the cost of psychological death and rebirth. Because awakening is not about becoming special. It's about becoming whole. And wholeness is slow. It is grounded. It is relational. It is lived in ordinary moments, conversations, work, conflict, rest. Not in permanent transcendence. If you want to continue exploring Jung's insights on awakening, individuation, and psychological integration, subscribe to Hidden Mind. And in the next video, we'll explore how to prepare the ego so it doesn't sabotage the awakening process. The psychological foundations Jung believed were essential before any real transformation can safely begin.